4 miles beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea, there is a ship. She stands upright on the slope of an undersea trench in water so deep that sunlight has never touched her. Her gun mounts still point outward, trained on an enemy that vanished in 1944. And painted on her bow, still legible in the lights of a submersible, is a number, 557. That number belonged to the USS Johnston, a destroyer that turned alone into a fleet led by the largest battleship ever built. 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, 11 destroyers. She attacked them anyway. The men who found her needed a submarine rated for the deepest place on Earth just to reach her deck. And 1 year later, the same team found her sister in arms, lying even deeper. The deepest shipwreck ever identified anywhere on this planet. This is the story of 2 hours off an island called Samar and the 80-year silence at the bottom of the sea that followed. In October of 1944, the United States invaded the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur waded ashore at Leyte Gulf and announced to a listening world, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." For Japan, this was the artery that could not be cut. Between the home islands and the oil fields to the south sat the Philippines. Lose them, and the fuel stops, and the fleet dies at anchor. So the Japanese Navy committed nearly everything it had left to one last all-or-nothing plan. It worked like a magic trick. A decoy force of aircraft carriers, with almost no aircraft left to fly from them, would dangle itself to the north as bait. The target of that bait was Admiral William Halsey and the American Third Fleet, the most powerful naval force on Earth. And while Halsey chased the empty carriers, a second fleet, the Center Force, would slip through the islands and fall on the invasion beaches from behind. The Center Force was built around the battleship Yamato. 72,000 tons, 9 guns measuring 18.1 inches across, the largest ever mounted on a warship, firing armor-piercing shells that weighed over 3,000 pounds each, out to a range of 26 miles. The plan nearly died early. American submarines ambushed the fleet off Palawan and sank the flagship right out from under Admiral Takeo Kurita. He had to swim for his life. The next day, carrier planes caught the fleet in the Philippine Sea and sent Yamato's sister ship, the Musashi, to the bottom. Kurita turned around. Halsey's pilots reported the center force in retreat, and that report is what sprang the trap. Because when the decoy carriers were sighted that evening, Halsey took his entire fleet north to kill them. Every carrier, every battleship, every ship. The strait he left behind, San Bernardino, sat open and unguarded in the dark. That night, Kurita turned his fleet around again. At dawn on October 25th, 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers came out of the morning haze off the island of Samar. Between those guns and the American beachhead stood exactly one formation. The Navy called it Taffy 3. Taffy 3 was not a battle fleet. It was 13 ships that were never supposed to see one. 6 escort carriers, the Fanshawe Bay, the St. Lo, the White Plains, the Kalinin Bay, the Kitcon Bay, the Gambier Bay. An escort carrier was a flight deck laid over a merchant hull. No armor, almost no guns. A top speed of about 20 miles an hour, slower than the battleships now hunting them. Their crews joked that the Navy's designation, CVE, stood for combustible, vulnerable, expendable. Guarding them was a screen of 3 destroyers, the Herman, the Hole, and the Johnston, and 4 destroyer escorts, the smallest fighting ships in the fleet. The biggest gun anywhere in Taffy 3 threw a 55-pound shell. Yamato's threw 3,200, and Yamato, by herself, weighed more than all 13 of those ships put together. Their job was humble: fly patrols, hunt submarines, support the soldiers ashore. The one thing they were never meant to do was fight a fleet. The captain of the Johnston was Commander Ernest Evans, a Cherokee and Creek officer from Pawnee, Oklahoma. On the day he took command of his new destroyer, he told the crew exactly who he was. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." 1 year later, off Samar, 327 men found out that he meant every word. At 6:45 in the morning, lookouts saw anti-aircraft fire blooming on the northern horizon. then masts, then the unmistakable pagoda towers of Japanese battleships. A pilot's voice broke over the radio, reporting battleships and cruisers where no enemy ships were supposed to exist. Admiral Clifton Sprague, commanding Taffy 3, reportedly demanded that the pilot double-check his contact. The answer arrived on its own. The horizon began to flash. Japanese gunners loaded their shells with dye markers, so each ship could spot its own fire. And so the ocean around the carriers began to erupt in towers of red, green, and yellow water. On the Johnston's bridge, gunnery officer Robert Hagen watched a colored geezer climb beside the bow and said, "Looks like somebody's mad at us." Sprague did everything right all at once: turn east, launch every aircraft, make smoke, run for a rain squall. But the arithmetic was merciless. Battleships moving at more than 30 miles an hour were chasing jeep carriers making barely 20. The gap would close in under an hour. Then, without waiting for orders, one ship peeled out of the formation and turned toward the enemy. The Johnston went to flank speed close to 40 miles an hour alone, straight at the most powerful surface fleet Japan ever sent to sea. She zigzagged between the shell splashes, closed the range, and hammered more than 200 5-inch shells at the leading heavy cruiser, aiming for the bridge and the deck, the places her small shells could actually hurt. Then, at 10,000 yards, she emptied every torpedo tube she had, all 10 of her torpedoes in the water. When the Johnston came back out of her own smoke, the heavy cruiser Kumano, flagship of the cruiser squadron, was staggering out of the battle with her bow blown off. The reply came almost immediately. Battleship shells found the Johnston. Hagen described the hits like a puppy being smacked by a truck. The blasts killed men across the ship, cut her power, took 2 of Evans's fingers, and blew the shirt off his back. He refused treatment, kept the bridge, and slipped his wounded ship into the rain squall, where her crew fought half of her guns back to life. Then the order every small ship had been dreading crackled over the radio. Sprague had seen what torpedoes could do. "Small boys, attack!" And the Johnston, already broken, turned around and went back in. On the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland picked up the intercom and told his crew the truth. They were entering, he said, a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival could not be expected. And they would do what damage they could. The Samuel B. Roberts, the Sammy B to her crew, was not built for any of this. A destroyer escort was a submarine hunter, half the size of a destroyer, slower than the battleships she was about to fight, with 2 5-inch guns and 3 torpedoes. She used the smoke and the rain the way an ambush predator uses the dark. She crept inside 4,000 yards, point-blank range at sea, and put her torpedoes in the water. Then she stood toe-to-toe with heavy cruisers, firing so fast for so long that she burned through more than 600 shells, nearly everything aboard, helping to wreck the heavy cruiser Chikuma alongside the destroyer Herman. She kept firing until one of her own guns tore itself apart. Then the battleship Congo found the range, and 14-inch shells did what 14-inch shells do. The ship they would later call the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship went down. The whole made her own torpedo run against a battleship column and paid the full price for it, taking fire from every direction until the sea finally took her and most of her crew. Overhead, the air wings fought with what they had, which was almost nothing. These were patrol aircraft loaded for hunting submarines. Pilots dropped depth charges against armored decks. They fired rockets. They strafed battleship bridges with machine guns, and when the racks ran empty, they kept diving anyway. Dry runs, bluffing capital ships into turning away from the carriers. It was not enough for everyone. Shells walked into the Gambier Bay, and by mid-morning she had rolled over and gone down, the only American aircraft carrier ever sunk by gunfire from enemy warships. And it was here, for the first and only time in her existence, that Yamato fired her great guns at enemy ships. The largest naval artillery ever built, turned on escort carriers with no armor at all. By any reasonable measure, the Johnston was already finished. One engine gone, compasses gone. Half her guns silent, her decks covered in her own dead. But when a Japanese column, a light cruiser leading destroyers, lined up for a torpedo run at the carriers, the Johnston limped into its path and opened fire on the leader until the entire column turned away. Then they closed in around her, enemy ships on every side firing. With the bridge wrecked, Evans, wounded, burned, and bleeding, ran the fight from the stern of his ship, shouting steering orders down through an open hatch to sailors below, who heaved the rudder from side to side by hand. At around 10 in the morning, after more than 3 hours under fire, the Johnston rolled over and sank. Men floating in the oil and debris watched a Japanese destroyer glide slowly past and swore for the rest of their lives that they saw her captain raise his hand in salute as she went down. And then, something happened that no one on the American side could explain. The Japanese fleet, with the carriers finally within reach, stopped, turned, and left. Admiral Kurita believed he had been fighting a far larger force. Some historians point to the ferocity of the defense. Some point to the endless air attacks, or to a commander who had already been swimming for his life once that week. 80 years later, they are still arguing. What is certain is that the center force never touched the invasion beaches. The trap had worked perfectly. And then 13 ships and a few hundred aircraft broke its teeth. The morning held one more first. Just before 11, a Japanese Zero dived deliberately into the flight deck of the St. Lo. Gasoline and ammunition did the rest, and she sank in half an hour, the first major warship in history destroyed by an organized kamikaze attack. A new and terrible kind of war had announced itself on the same morning in the same patch of sea. The battle took 2.5 hours, the waiting took 2 days. Hundreds of survivors, burned, wounded, and coated in fuel oil, went into a sea that gave them nothing. Help took 2 days to find them. For 50 hours, men clung to rafts and floater nets in open water. Sharks came, wounds festered. Men who had survived the guns did not survive the sea. When the rescue ships finally arrived, they pulled about 1,200 men from the water, from the Johnston, the Hull, the Sammy B, and the Gambier Bay. Hundreds of their shipmates never came out. Of the Johnston's crew of 327, 186 were lost. Only about 50 of them were killed by the enemy's guns. 45 made it to the rafts and died there of their wounds before help came, and 92 went into the water alive and were simply never seen again. Commander Evans was one of them. Men remembered him in the water after the ship went down. Then he was gone. His Medal of Honor, the first ever awarded to a Native American in the United States Navy, was accepted by his family. The ships themselves fell somewhere no one could follow. Beneath the battle site, the seafloor drops away toward the Philippine Trench, one of the deepest scars on the planet. The Titanic lies about 12,500 feet down. These ships fell far past that kind of depth, into water a few degrees above freezing, into blackness where the pressure builds to nearly 10,000 pounds on every square inch. For 3/4 of a century, the Navy knew roughly where its ships had died and had no way on Earth to visit the graves. In October of 2019, a research ship called the Petrel, funded by the late Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, swept the edge of the trench with sonar and found wreckage at 20,400 feet, torn hull plating, a gun mount, the scattered bones of a Fletcher-class destroyer. It was already the deepest shipwreck ever located, but the expedition's robot was at its rated limit, and the main hull lay deeper still, down the slope, beyond where their lights could follow. They believed it was the Johnston. They could not prove it. Proof required the deepest diving crewed submersible in existence. Victor Vescovo had already taken his titanium submersible, the limiting factor, to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, the deepest point in the ocean. In March of 2021, he brought it to Samar. 2 dives, 8 hours each, down through 4 miles of black water. And there, standing upright on the slope at 21,180 feet, was a destroyer. Her forward gun mounts were still trained where the enemy had been, twin torpedo racks still bolted to her deck, and empty, because she had fired everything she had, and on both sides of her bow, in paint that has not seen the sun since 1944, A hull number, 557. The Johnston. Found, identified, and left exactly as she was. The expedition took nothing and touched nothing. 21,000 feet down, she is a war grave, the deepest that human eyes had ever seen. She held that record for 1 year. In June of 2022, Vescovo's team came back to find the Sammy B 6 dives across a single week, sweeping the seafloor with sonar. And on June 22nd, the lights found her, broken into 2 pieces lying 30 feet apart at 22,621 feet. The headlines went around the world, the deepest shipwreck ever identified anywhere on Earth. A 1,300-ton submarine hunter that charged battleships resting deeper than any wreck human beings have ever reached. Somewhere in that same darkness, still missing, are the hull and the Gambier Bay. On that same expedition, the team went looking for the Gambier Bay, scanning the seafloor at depths of nearly 23,000 feet. They found nothing. For the hull, the records of where she went down are too thin to even begin a search. To this day, the sea has kept them both. There is something the deep ocean does that nothing on land can do. It stops time. The Titanic, nearly 2 miles shallower, has been visited, photographed, salvaged, and argued over for 40 years. The Johnston stands alone in the dark, upright, guns out, facing the enemy exactly as her crew left her. The cold slows everything down there: rust, decay, time itself. The ocean did not destroy these ships. The battle did that. The ocean has kept them cold, dark, and untouched, deeper than the reach of almost every machine on the planet. And it kept them just barely close enough for one submersible to fall 4 miles through the dark and read a number off a painted bow, so that a destroyer that died holding the line would not stay anonymous forever. 327 names sailed on the Johnston. 186 of them are still out there somewhere in the dark off Samar, beneath the deepest gravestone on Earth. Her flag was never lowered. Her guns were never silenced by her own crew. She simply fought until the sea closed over her. And then she waited 80 years for someone to come deep enough to ask her name. The ocean keeps its secrets. This was one of them. It is not anymore. If stories like this belong in your week, subscribe to Blues below. We tell the ocean's true stories, from the creatures of the abyss to the ships and the sailors the sea refused to give back. Because the ocean keeps its secrets. Someone has to go down and ask.